I came across the story of Lillian Andren earlier this year when I was interviewing Bruce Bonahady, who's the head of Urella and a father of 2 severely disabled children with cerebral palsy. And he told me of how the Productivity Commissioner, who is presently inquiring into disability and how we should support disability in Australia, had been absolutely floored, just shocked beyond measure by a story told to her by one of the people who'd come to her hearing in Brisbane. And the person was Lillian Andren, and she told a story of how she had suffered a spinal injury when she'd actually tried to save someone from hitting their head on rocks at a private swimming pool. And she'd held out her arms to try and protect this person as she was standing in the water. And as the person fell, she took the full weight of this 90-kilo man, and it stripped all the muscles from her spine, and then all the nerve endings would no longer work. She did not, however, sever her spine, which was something which ended up profoundly affecting her life, because it meant that she slipped through all the available spinal packages or care packages which might have helped her live her life. So she also was not in a road accident, and she wasn't at work. So from every point of view, she slipped through the cracks. What it means in reality is that she is incontinent as a result of her injuries, but because she has such an inadequate care framework around her and only minimal government assistance, she has carers come in 3 times a week to shower her. She lives in Brisbane. She has had to leave work and live off a very meagre superannuation fund. She has no air conditioning. If you just think about that for a moment, in order to qualify for the showers 3 times a week, she has to be incontinent every single day. As she told the hearing, she has to sit in her own urine 4 days a week in order to get showers for 3 days a week. She cannot get them to change the linen more than once a fortnight. They come in for 60 minutes once a fortnight and change her linen. She has no idea when the carers are going to come in and wash her if she needs to go to a doctor's appointment. She has become very isolated as a result, and she finds her home. She was once a meticulous housekeeper, and now at age 37 she finds herself living in a home she describes as filthy, because the home carers will come in and do a maintenance clean but won't do the kind of deep clean that all of us do when Christmas threatens and we're worried about the opinion of our relatives. So this is the most extraordinary story, and when Patricia Scott heard it, and when John Walsh, who himself is a quadriplegic, heard this story, they were galvanised. And alongside the many, many, many other stories that they heard as they went around the country from carers who were desperate and from people with a disability who receive such woefully inadequate support and care, they recognised just what an appallingly hopeless system we actually have. In fact, in my recent monthly article on the subject of disability and on the subject of having some remedy for this, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, I called it after Benjamin Disraeli in the 19th century. He described Britain as having 2 nations, a rich nation and a poor nation, and that the 2 nations never conversed. And I think that moment of shock on the part of Patricia Scott, very eminent and cool-headed economist, that emotional shock is an emotional shock that many people who I've told that story to experience, because people actually don't realise that if you have a disability in this society, if you are a carer of a disability, you pass from one nation to another, just as in Benjamin Disraeli's time. You pass from a wealthy, affluent Australia that so many of us know into a very different one. For those who don't live in that nation, you have to realise how many of our fellow citizens are affected by these kinds of conditions. They also, nobody realises that all of us could be affected. It might be Lillian Andren today, but it could be you tomorrow. It could be your daughter or brother or father or mother tomorrow, because we don't currently in Australia have any adequate system of national disability insurance. The numbers of people who presently have a disability, there's about 1/5 of the population, about 4.5 million people have a disability of some kind. So that's 1/5 of the population. About 750,000 have a severe or profound disability, that is, of those under the age of 65. 500,000 people, about the size of Tasmania, the population of Tasmania, are people who are primary carers of those with a disability. A further 2.4 million, or 10% of the population, are non-primary carers. But disability does not, even at this point, rate an outer ministry in the government. Our country's never been wealthier, and yet disability services are currently rationed tighter than petrol in Britain during the Blitz. Funding's a lottery. It depends on what state you're in. In some states, they have brought in support and care along the TAC line or along road accident, the kind of insurance packages with road accident victims. But in many states, it is very inadequate, and they don't have those kinds of support schemes. In West Australia, for example, about 87% of applications for high-level support are rejected. One mother who had a severely disabled son had applied for 6 years for assistance, quite intensive care that her son needed. And when she finally got the package, she burst into tears. What she said to the press was it wasn't relief, it was survivor guilt, because she knew all those who were going to continue going through the struggle that she had just been through. The economics of disability are bleak. Nearly 1/3 of households containing people with a disability live close to or below the poverty line, compared to 1/10 of Australia overall. They're more likely to be unemployed. Currently, Australia is about 19 out of 27 OECD nations in terms of the way we rank in employment of people with a disability. That's a point I'll come back to later. Unsurprisingly then, they're more likely to be on income support, on the disability support pension, and those carers on a carer allowance. They're more likely to be in public housing or to be renting than to own their own homes. And many people, of course, in order to support the costs of care of someone who's been injured or who acquires a disability, will have to mortgage their house or sell their house. And I've known quite a few people who've had to do that in order to pay for the costs of disability. Many children with additional needs don't get the early intervention that they desperately require, and as their loving parents know, every year they don't get that intervention, more and more behavioural problems and difficulties can arise, and educational deficits. Here's another shocking fact. The estimate's around 30% of our prison population consists of people with an intellectual disability. If you add those who have mental illness, it's a staggering proportion of our prison population. The fact that anyone in our prisons has an intellectual disability, to me, seems a matter of some shock. But the fact that there's up to 1/3 of those people there is a national disgrace. Amongst carers, depression is higher than in the general community, about 50% compared to 6%. And we don't really hear much about this shadow care economy, as we hear people talking endlessly about the more visible economy. But the replacement value of that care economy for people who have a disability is about $30.5 billion annually. Many of those carers have to work part-time or leave the workforce altogether to care for people with a disability. And we need, as a nation, to support them to do that essential work. And yet we continue to let them do that heavy lifting with very little of the kind of support that really makes it possible for them to live in a reasonable way. We don't have enough respite beds, for example. In one state, South Australia, I'm not sure if this is the case at the moment, but at one point recently, every single respite bed was taken by someone who had been relinquished by a desperate family into permanent care. as John Walsh, who, as I said earlier, is himself a quadriplegic, commented, there are many, many ageing parents who are desperate because they have children who are now into middle age. John Walsh told me this story too about, John Walsh said that there was a death spiral in this system whereby these people could not, for the foreseeable future, look after these adult children with a disability, and wondered what on earth would happen to them when they died. John Della Bosca told me an interesting story. He was former Minister for New South Wales, Disability in New South Wales, and presently now the campaign manager for everyaustraliancounts.com, which is a campaign on behalf of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. He told me that he got the shock of his life when he first called a community meeting about disability, being rather ignorant at that time about the area, and he expected it to be mainly parents of children with particular needs like autism or special needs in education. Instead, he said the average age in the room was between 70 and 80. And the first thing that was said to him was, "What will happen to my daughter when I die?" So that is a really omnipresent terror amongst those who are caring for people with a disability at the moment. Again, one might think, and many people said this to me while I was researching the article, well, surely Medicare covers a lot of the expenses of disability, but it doesn't. It doesn't even cover entirely the costs of something as basic as a wheelchair. So that before someone moves into a wheelchair and taking up crucial time in their movement, for example, if they've had a car accident, if they've had some injury to their physiotherapy and their, the kinds of mobility that they may be able to acquire, takes precious time in order to have actually charities still rattling tin cans on street corners in order to raise the money to cover the difference between what an ordinary family can afford and what it costs to provide an adequate wheelchair. So that Bruce Bonahady sent me letters showing particular people having grants of $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 that money had been raised for, and giving them really crucial kinds of aids. So it's extraordinary in the modern welfare state that we rely still on charity rather than having these things as simply a matter of provided as a matter of course. So as John Della Bosca said, this is a system that needs a wrecking ball. It needs a wrecking ball taken to it and starting over. And it needs a big idea, and that's what this national disability insurance scheme really is. It would cover some 360,000 people with a profound or severe disability. It would double existing funding, which is from about $6 billion to $12 billion, and it will come out of the general taxpayer general revenue. And rather than any kind of Medicare levy, it's at the moment it seems that the preferred idea is to have it just coming out of general revenue and provided by the Commonwealth rather than the states, because the states do not have the tax base to fund disability. It will also really a paradigm shift in terms of the philosophy of how you provide for people with a disability, and that is to give funding much more directly to the person. They can either cash it out themselves and administer their own care package, or alternatively they can move through brokers in the system to provide the kind of care that they need. But the idea is to target the disability dollar much more towards the individual rather than going through service providers like Urella and many, many others, which ends up as a very kind of top-heavy welfare bureaucracy and with less funds than should trickling down to those people who actually most need it, the people with a disability. And it's going to incorporate systems and principles from the no-fault insurance schemes, which we have already in the transport accident system, which are much better for the recipient and much more cost-effective. And it will concentrate on early intervention. I mean, one of the really crazy things is that we know with children, for example, if you intervene early and give them the sort of support that they need, that they can go on to lead, in many cases, very productive and active lives. They can gain an education and have opportunities that we'd want. Instead, if they don't get that early intervention, then the problems can multiply. And so there's this crazy thing of saving $6,000 now this year in terms of funding early intervention, but later funding a $70,000 a year or $80,000 a year place in an institution. It's just crackers economic logic. So the NDIS has got a lot going for it. And I'd urge all of you to go onto the website, everyaustraliancounts.com, and sign the petitions to continue the pressure on the Gillard government to bring it in. And they have said that they're in favour of the idea. There's a lot of support for the NDIS at the moment. But I want to go a bit further than that today and say that the whole issue of disability at the moment in our politics should go much deeper than this. We need to think of the area of disability as really the unfinished business of our democracy, as a new frontier of justice. The disability rights movement was really a late flowering member of the 1960s and 70s civil rights movements. And it did the most fundamental things of overturning the idea of the person with a disability as an object of charity. It placed at the very centre the idea of a wonderful philosopher, Simone Weil, which is respect is due to the human being as such and is not a matter of degree. Is not a matter of degree. But it was more than just a matter of having equal opportunities. Embedded in the disability rights movement is something, I think, which is profound. It's a desire for recognition. It's that existential cry from the human heart. Treat me as your equal. Do not condescend to me. Do not patronise me. Do not see me as a lesser human being because I happen to have a disability. Rhonda Galbally, a long-time activist, told me, and a person who has suffered polio as a child, she told me how liberating it was in the 1960s to come across this idea of being a person with a disability, because before that you were called, even further back, was a cripple. You were seen often that it was an act of God, and that was your fault, that somehow you had committed some evil act, and so that there was a wickedness about you, which was why you ended up with a disability. Then it moved to the idea of being crippled. Then it moved to the idea of being disabled, which was something in advance, but still placed the question of a disability before the person. Then this idea of a person with a disability, person first and disability second. But I'd like to take that even further in our new frontier of justice and say that I'd like to hear less about disability and more about ability of the person who has a disability. I'd like to hear more about the capabilities of people with a disability, not concentrating on what they can't do, but removing the barriers and giving them the necessary supports to do what they can do. So not a national disability strategy, but a national capability strategy, aimed at removing all those barriers that they found in a government report called Shut Out in 2009, which found, it's a brilliant report if any of you want to look it up on the internet, and it found just so many instances of not social inclusion, which is the present government's mantra, but social exclusion. And it showed how deeply people with a disability and their carers had gone, that people with a disability had gone from being shut in institutions to being shut out from society in crucial ways. Let's take just one example of focusing on people with a disability and their capabilities. At the same time, we've got this, I think, quite inspiring story of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We have tabloid TV and tabloid newspapers running campaigns continually about the disability pension. Many of you may have seen it on Today Tonight. There's always some very fat person or someone with a bad back who's lifting a rubbish tin that looks very heavy. And I have this hideous torture machine called an elliptical trainer, and I do my exercise at night and I watch these programs. And you would not believe how many of them are about the disability pension. And there's never a story about someone who actually deserves the disability pension, that it's good that they're on the disability pension and it actually saves them from starvation. You don't hear that. There was a title I came across in the Daily Telegraph. I'll read it to you. Fat people, drug and alcohol addicts paid to stay home. The article in question pointed to a small number of morbidly obese people who usually suffer related health issues. So there's actually a reason for them being on the disability pension. But the actual evidence on drug addicts and alcoholics, there wasn't any. There was no evidence whatever provided in this article. All that it said was that the rates of people who were alcoholics and drug addicts had increased. But in the format of the article, with that headline, it looked as if the increase in numbers of people with those conditions meant that they're also on the disability pension, because the next phrase was, after indicating the numbers of people who had now these conditions, it said that in fact it was very easy to get the disability pension. But those two facts were not proved. The linkage of those facts was not proved in the article. So in other words, you went away with the impression that fat, lazy, drug-addled people were on the disability pension. They might like to know a friend of mine who left work even though she loved it in order to care for her child, because her child acquired a tumour which ate away her child's spine. And so that child has a disability pension. There are case after case after case, if you really look into it, of those pensions going to people who need it and deserve it, and who actually would love to work if they could, but either can't or alternatively have barriers to them working, which is something I now want to come to. If we're going to have a national capability strategy, we need to think about this. I would like to place the journalist who wrote that article and many other similar articles, and I would like to place all those politicians who are now campaigning on the disability pension issue at the bottom of a two-storey building in a wheelchair. And I'd like to say the job interview is up on the second storey, and there are only stairs to get there. Good luck. Because that is what people with a disability face. Or they face being vision impaired, going along to a job, being good enough for the job, getting the job, but then being told that it costs too much to have adaptive technology to a computer to make it possible for them to do the type of secretarial work that they'd both enjoy doing, to get them off the disability pension, and which they are more than capable of doing, but you don't actually have the government assistance to that employer to make it possible for them to do it. So the Gillard government is committed to this idea of the NDIS, but it's moving at a glacial pace. And meanwhile, all those with a disability, like Lillian Andren, are waiting. They wait. And they are waiting above all for us as a nation to place their welfare, their care, at the centre of our nation's heart. Thank you.